Now, without further ado, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing to you a Canadian icon, the Honourable Judge Marion Buller. Judge Buller is a member of the Mistawasis Nehiyawak Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. She started her legal career as a lawyer, practicing in criminal, administrative, and human rights law. She was the Commission Counsel for the Cariboo-Chilcotin Justice Inquiry. She was director and president of the Indigenous Bar Association and other organizations. Judge Buller was the first Indigenous woman appointed to the Provincial Court in BC. She has presided over courts in many locations, including the Northern Circuit Court. She founded the First Nations Court and provided the foundation for the Indigenous Family Court. These are courts that consider the special circumstances of Indigenous people. Judge Buller has also written extensively about Indigenous and human rights. After 22 years, Judge Buller was appointed as the Chief Commissioner for the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. This was a precedent-setting and truly national inquiry. The National Inquiry's strongly worded final report and calls for justice have attracted both national and international attention. Judge Buller has received numerous awards in recognition of her contributions to the advancement of Indigenous and human rights. And on a more personal note, I can say that a longtime friend, now passed, Jamie Lee Hamilton, who is well known in our province, carried deep love and respect for Judge Buller. And I know that she would have been as thrilled and as honored as we are to welcome Judge Buller here today. Thank you for being here, Judge. Please help me welcome the Honourable Judge Marion Buller.
Thank you so much, Tracy. I always get a little teary when I think of Jamie Lee and how much I really missed her and how important she was in my life. Thank you. That was a wonderful introduction. Now I know why I have all the gray hair. Thank you to EVA for inviting me to speak with you today. And a special shout out to Misha and Fiona and the staff at EVA for their patience and kindness with me. I'm coming today to you from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. I'm in a suburb of what's known as Vancouver. I want to congratulate each and every one of you for getting up in the morning and doing the work you so carefully and lovingly do every day, especially in these most trying of all circumstances. My heart goes out to each one of you. As Deborah Sparrow said, if I could wrap each and every one of you in a blanket, I would. I am so grateful for the work that you do tirelessly every day. And I want to also thank your families for sharing you with all of us. I know how hard your work is. I understand, and I thank you. Which leads me to the title of the work that I want to do with you today. I want to talk about the survivors of violence. And I want to share with you a moral and ethical dilemma I have and questions I've asked myself for years when I've been dealing with survivors of violence. I'm hoping you might have some answers for me. First of all, as Tracy said, yes, I was a judge and I was the Chief Commissioner of the National Inquiry, but I'm also, and I hope I get this right, a stepmom, a sister, a grandma, an auntie, a great auntie, a niece, cousin. I think that's it. Those are my equally, if not more important roles. Now, this morning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of the National Inquiry, the final report, our findings of fact, our calls for justice, and also moving forward, what's next? And let's deal with those ethical and moral questions that I have. Now, I am referring to speaking notes. I've got them right here. I'm not texting somebody when I'm looking down. And I'm going to blast through a lot of information very quickly. If you would like me to repeat anything during the Q&A session, I'm happy to do that. I'd like to leave some time for some dialogue between all of us, because building relationships is what this is all about, as difficult as it can be at times by Zoom. I'm going to be referring to our website from time to time. And by that, I mean the National Inquiry's website. It's still up and running thanks to the Privy Council office. The website is mmIWG-FFADA.ca. I'll repeat that, mmIWG-FFADA.ca. So having said that, I want to focus on survivors of violence. First of all, let's talk about the work of the National Inquiry. Well, the terms of reference were very lengthy, but I think that they can be summarized as saying this: we had to inquire into all causes, all systemic causes of all types of violence against Indigenous women and girls. And then, of course, to make recommendations to end those types of violence. Now, in the course of doing our work, we added 2S to our family, and that is short for Two-Spirit. And that's an Indigenous term for people who are at various places along the gender spectrum. They hold traditionally a very important role in our societies, and we felt we needed to include them for that reason. But also, we knew that 2S people experience whole additional layers of violence, and we needed to learn from them and their experiences. We started our work on September 1st, 2016, and we finished our work on June 30th, 2019. It was a very short period to do an incredible amount of work. The 3 commissioners and myself heard from 2,386 people. These were family members of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. This included survivors of violence. We heard from experts and traditional knowledge keepers and people with lived experience. We held 15 community hearings across Canada. During those hearings, we heard from family members, survivors, people with lived experience. We heard about their experiences with violence, and we also heard from them about their recommendations for change. We also held what I call subject matter hearings, and these were hearings in which we heard from experts and traditional knowledge keepers and people, again, with lived experience. And I hope I can do this. I might have to refer to my notes. The 9 subject areas were policing. Now that included the RCMP, Indigenous policing, municipal, provincial policing. We also heard about racism, Indigenous laws, colonial violence, family welfare, child and family welfare, the sex industry and human trafficking. I have to look at my notes, I'm sorry. Government services, human rights law, criminal justice system. I think that's it. Anyway, 9 subject areas. We also had a series of roundtables. These were informal discussions with people, again, all across Canada, specifically related to 4 issues. One was the issues specifically faced by Inuit women, even though we heard from Inuit women in all of our hearings and issues that Inuit women face, of course. But we knew we had to focus more on Inuit issues. We also had roundtables regarding Métis issues, because even though we heard about Métis traditions, we heard from Métis families, survivors of violence, traditional knowledge keepers, we knew we had to dig even deeper about the issues faced by Métis women and girls and 2S people. Then we had a separate roundtable on the issues faced by 2S people all across Canada. Again, because we knew we had to dig deeper into those layers of violence that the 2S people unfortunately face. And then we had a separate roundtable on Quebec because of the tremendous differences in history of Indigenous people in Quebec. I learned a lot, to be honest with you. All of these hearings were held coast to coast to coast. In addition to our hearings, we had a group of people called statement gatherers who went to small communities, who met with family members, survivors, people with lived experiences in band offices or gas stations, or sometimes even in their own homes, to collect their stories, which we called truths, the family members' truths. I just want to share a personal experience with you. You know, I thought I knew a lot. Of course, judges do that. But, you know, there were all across Canada, there were similarities, yet differences in the causes of violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And a really stark example to me is issues faced by Inuit women. I learned a lot. Not only do they face issues about safe housing, or any housing for that matter, they face a whole different level because of climate, of geographical isolation, cultural differences, but they also face daily issues regarding food security and access to local medical care. So we get in the South here, we get to take a lot for granted in terms of services and issues. Our Inuit cousins in the North have a whole different layer. It's important to understand that we're not all the same, and we don't have all the same issues. Our work was guided by a family advisory circle. This was made up of people representative all across Canada, family members of lost loved ones, as well as survivors of violence. We had a huge research team who worked so hard behind the scenes. They did a wonderful job in not only synthesizing existing research regarding violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, but they also did new research. And of course, they helped us invaluably in writing our interim report that we published in November of 2017, and then writing our final report. They were brilliant, brilliant women. So why did we include survivors of violence in our work when our terms of reference didn't specifically state them? Well, we figured, the commissioners and I figured, that we could learn a lot about survivors of violence and their lived experiences. And you know, we did. We heard about how violence had become normalized in their families and their communities, and how in some, I won't say some, in many cases, how violence was equated with love, and how there was never just one act of violence experienced by a survivor. Survivors told us that they lived, and sometimes still do live, in a constant threat of violence. And by violence, I mean physical violence, mental violence, sexual violence, and emotional violence. They also told us that the risk of interpersonal violence was heightened by intergenerational trauma, poverty, homelessness, addictions, barriers to education, employment, and training, so many additional layers of violence. The survivors of violence were absolutely emphatic that any changes to any existing programs, any new projects, have to acknowledge the much broader intergenerational and historical context of colonial violence. I think I can summarize a lot of what they said, although I don't like necessarily to speak for them, is that their lived experience led to a lack of trust. And let me give you some quotes, and I have to read them just for accuracy's sake. One survivor of violence told us, "The people that I think are going to protect me are not going to do that. I don't remember them trying to help me." Now, of course, as most of you, if not all of you, already know, that especially young Indigenous girls and 2S people become targets for pimps and traffickers, because the pimps and traffickers are very happy to help, air quotes, help them. This increases, of course, the vulnerability of our young people. We heard from Dr. Alan Wade, who's a psychologist who works with people who have experienced trauma. And, his testimony was very telling in many ways, but I'm going to quote him. He said, "Unfortunately, a vast majority of victims, when you ask them, when you reported violence, did your life get better or worse? Most will tell you that their life got worse." So again, so many survivors of violence and family members for that matter as well, I shouldn't leave them out entirely, came to believe that my personal right, my human right, my Indigenous right to feel safe, my right to security doesn't matter. And that's become the norm. I don't matter has become the norm. Survivors of violence also pointed out that there's a lack of culturally appropriate services, especially when it comes to safe housing. They also told us that some, not all, anti-violence supports fail to accommodate the unique needs of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. For example, and they told us that there are programs, but they're not healing programs. And so many Indigenous women and girls and 2S people want a focus on healing. They also, and this is not news to you, spoke about how wait lists and cancellations of programs and programs on hold really created uncertainty and unsafety, lack of safety for them as well. They pointed out, as did service providers, again, no news to you, that the lack of long-term financial support for anti-violence services created a lack of safety and a lack of security for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And they also pointed out, especially people in remote areas, that there was a lack of local support services for them. As one witness said, one survivor said, well, programs and services come and go. Again, this contributes to their lack of safety and their lack of certainty, lack of trust. We heard from many survivors that they actually made a choice, a clear choice to change their lives, to escape violence. For many, motivation was this would let them keep their children, or it would help them to get their children back. And by escaping violence, they would end that intergenerational trauma because they all desperately wanted better lives for their children. And it seemed to me the first step was safe housing to help them make that decision and to leave a violent environment. As I said, survivors not only told us their truths, the truths about their lives, they also told us about how to make it better. And their recommendations formed the basis for our calls for justice. I learned Indigenous women and girls and 2S people know what's necessary to keep themselves safe and to keep the people around them safe. Diane Redsky, who was a witness, and some of you may know for the programs she runs for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in Winnipeg, said, "The women themselves will tell us what it is that needs to be within the programming." So when we developed every one of our resources, it has been done in consultation with the people who will benefit from that service. Diane was so uplifting and so inspiring. Many, many Indigenous women and girls and 2S people told us about the importance of relationship building, about having a voice, about being heard, about being involved in the decisions affecting their lives and their children's lives. And I just want to step back for a moment. And I know I'm lumping a lot of groups together, Indigenous women, and there are lots of different types. Indigenous girls, again, there's no pan-indigeneity. Girls, no pan-indigeneity at all, and 2S people. Again, I'm doing that for time. if nothing else. But I just want to step back and say how brilliantly motivated and educated Indigenous girls and young women are about the issues that they face and the solutions to those issues. And I hope we always leave space for our young people to tell us what we need to do. So, having talked about our work for a little bit, I'm going to move on to the final report, Reclaiming Power in Place. We used that title because we learned from all of the wonderful wisdom we gathered from our family members, survivors, and traditional knowledge keepers, experts, and people with lived experience, is that in order for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people to be safe, they have to, and we have to help them reclaim their traditional positions of power and their traditional positions of place in their communities. We made numerous findings of fact based on what everyone told us and based on research as well. First of all, Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, especially people with lived experience, have to be at decision-making tables as equal partners. And I know it sounds almost like a cliche now, but this was one of our guiding principles as we did our work. People know the problems and they know the solutions. Again, a guiding principle from the work and finding of fact, of course, that we made from the work that we did too, is that the colonization of Indigenous people has created the social, economic, political, and geographical marginalization of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And colonization of Indigenous people has traumatized generations of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And that colonization continues even today. Now, this marginalization and trauma are the pervasive reasons for the institutionalization of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in residential schools, in the foster care system, in prisons, and in penitentiaries. Of course, Indigenous women and girls and 2S people experience extreme rates of overcrowding and homelessness, especially in Northern Canada. And we found that the lack of safety or safe housing, transition homes, any type of shelter really impacts the wellness and safety of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And the housing crisis that exists all across Canada is a significant contributor to the violence that Indigenous women and girls and 2S people face. And as all of you know, this is not news to you, that the existing social and economic services for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people are often plagued by huge, huge gaps in resources and infrastructure. Further, such services are often placed in unsafe areas and are not culturally appropriate, thereby continuing that lack of safety and security for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Of course, there was our controversial finding of genocide. I'm just going to say there was more than enough evidence, compelling evidence, to make that finding as uncomfortable as it was to do. Now, turning to our 231 calls for justice. That's what we named our recommendations because family members and survivors said they wanted justice. Now, there is a framework for reading and understanding our calls for justice. First of all, that all of them have to be read from a decolonizing perspective, that Indigenous women and girls and 2S people have to be equal partners at decision-making tables, especially those with lived experience, and especially including family members of lost loved ones and survivors of violence. Now, the calls for justice are aimed at specific readers. For example, we have calls for justice aimed at all governments, and that includes Indigenous governments. We have calls aimed at policing, health, child welfare, criminal justice, extraction industry, the media, and all Canadians. I hope I haven't left any categories out. I'll just briefly run through some that I've kind of cherry picked that I think are perhaps the most relevant for you in the work that you do. In our calls for justice for all governments, we said, amongst others, that all governments have to uphold the social and economic rights of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And that includes, amongst others, access to safe housing, clean water, clean drinking water, of course, and adequate food. We also called on all governments to recognize Indigenous people's rights to self-determination in the pursuit of economic and social development. And this means, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm sorry if it's a little brief, this means that, or includes all governments, including Indigenous governments, must support all resource-based community, must support and resource community-based supports and solutions designed to improve the security, the safety of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. This means long-term sustainable funding designed to meet the needs and objectives as defined by Indigenous people and their communities. We also called on all governments to support programs and services for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in the sex industry to promote their safety and security. Again, we called for long-term, stable funding for programs and services delivered in partnership with people with lived experience, Indigenous women and girls, 2S people. We called for a guaranteed annual livable income for all Canadians, and we called on all governments to establish long-term sustainable funding for services for Indigenous women who are homeless, near homeless, dealing with food insecurity, in poverty, who are fleeing violence, or have been subjected to sexualized violence and exploitation. And all of these services, transition houses, must be appropriate to the cultural needs and available wherever Indigenous women reside. And finally, again, all governments to ensure adequate plans and funding are put into place for safe and affordable transit and transportation services and infrastructure for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Northern Canada is a nightmare. Just leave it at that. With respect to victim services, we called on governments to develop enhanced, holistic, comprehensive approaches to victim services for families and survivors of violence. We called on governments to support financially victims of crime and trauma, and to provide care for them as well. These supports and services, of course, must be Indigenous-led. We also called for legislative leave, and I might add paid leave, and disability benefits for victims of crime or traumatic events. We also called for independent legal services for victims of crime and traumatic events as well. We called on the media to ensure authentic and appropriate representation of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people in order to address the negative and discriminatory stereotypes in the media. For health and wellness providers, we called on governments and providers to establish Indigenous-led programs and services, and especially that health and wellness services address trauma. We called on health service providers to establish and carry out, again, in partnership, violence prevention measures, as well as training of service providers in the history of colonialism in Canada. For police services, there were many, but I think perhaps the most relevant for today's purposes would be that non-Indigenous police services ensure that they have the capacity and resources to serve and protect Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. And we called for specialized units where necessary. We also called on police services to build respectful relationships with Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, with improved communication and a national strategy and standards for the investigation of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. I know I'm racing through these. For those in child welfare, we called on them to stop apprehending children on the basis of poverty. We also said that if apprehension needs to happen, as a last resort, that the child goes to a family member or community member, and that family member or community member is funded at the same level as others, because that doesn't happen. We also called on child welfare service providers to develop comprehensive plans for children aging out of care, because so many of them are vulnerable young people who fall into the hands of pimps and human traffickers. They're targeted. Also, we called on child welfare officials to fully investigate the deaths of Indigenous children in care. For extractive and development industries, we called on them to consider the safety and security of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people, and their equitable benefit from development at all stages of planning, and that there be agreements throughout the licensing progress related to the impacts of the work or the project on the safety and security of Indigenous women and girls, and this to be part of the actual licensing process. We made several calls regarding Correctional Services of Canada. I won't go into them today, but we called on all Canadians to change. And we called on them to denounce and speak out against violence against Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. We called on all Canadians to decolonize themselves by learning the true history of Canada. And we called on all Canadians to create time and space for relationships. Now that's, again, I'm cherry picking because there are more calls, even for all, or with all Canadians as well. There's good news since the national inquiry. I've heard from so many family members and survivors who have connected with services in their communities, services such as yours. They've got their kids back. They've found family members who they thought were long lost. They've gone back to school. They've charged abusers. They have been able to connect with specific types of trauma counseling that have served them really well. They're clean and sober. They're safe. So thank you, all of you who have helped those women and girls and 2S people. So now what, moving forward, and I'm going to share with you quickly my moral and ethical dilemma. Sometimes without knowing it, when we speak for people, or when we're even trying to empower people, we end up silencing them. And that's been my moral and ethical dilemma. In the work that I'm doing, am I inadvertently silencing the voices of survivors? Am I empowering them, but making them voiceless? So moving forward, again, sharing that ethical and moral dilemma with you. Programs and services for Indigenous women and girls and 2S people must be developed and delivered in partnership with them, especially people with lived experience. And it must not only empower them, but be led by them in the way that is going to work for them. So here are some questions that I ask myself regularly and have in the past, even as a judge. Maybe more so as a judge. Back to this delicate balance of speaking for and silencing. Because I just want to share, and I know this is kind of negative, but I want to share with just a few quotes with you. This is what survivors said. I had no say in what happened to me. I had no say in what program I got. No one listened to me. I went along with it because I didn't think I had a choice. I've heard that at the National Inquiry. I have heard that in court, and I have no doubt you've heard these as well. So, delicate balance, knowing when to act and knowing when to back off. Listening is really important. Listening before doing. And taking this decolonizing approach. As so many Indigenous women and girls and 2S people have said, gone are the days. So now, not to us, not for us, but now it's by us and with us. So, turning now to the questions I've been asking myself for a very long time about the work that I do. Here's the first one. Am I, or the work that I do, my program, taking away the voices of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people? Am I speaking for them when they can speak for themselves? My next question, am I, or the work I do, my program, empowering Indigenous women and girls and 2S people? How do I know? Do I ever ask them? Is my program, the work I do, treating Indigenous women and girls and 2S people as equal decision makers? Is my program better offered by Indigenous women and girls and 2S people? Is my program, is the work that I'm doing, continuing to colonize Indigenous women and girls and 2S people? Is my program, the work that I do, built on or perpetuating systemic racism? These are difficult, these are hard questions and very unsettling questions to ask yourself and your organization. There may be other questions that you want to ask yourself and your organization, but I can tell you, having this dialogue with yourself and with others, even on a daily basis, is essential for the safety of Indigenous women and girls and 2S people. Thank you. I'm trying to leave time for some questions and some comments, which I welcome. And if you would like me to repeat anything, I'm very willing to do it, because I know I blasted through a lot of information, but have those hard conversations with yourselves. Thank you all so very much for listening and for sharing with me. And thank you for the work that you do. Tracy.
Oh my goodness. That was such an articulate and deep overview of volumes of findings and calls for justice and recommendations. And I don't know, it's mind-boggling how you just did that. Thank you so much. And it's also mind-boggling, and you have all of our deep appreciation and respect for the years that you spent in gathering the findings and listening deeply, as you say. I concur completely. We are lucky in this country to have you walk with us and among us, and thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
We do have some questions that have come in, and thank you to the people that are coordinating the questions and to the people online that have voted for the questions. My first question, Judge Buller, is to ask, only if you know, and this that you may not know, is there processes in place to ensure that the calls to justice are implemented? And the second part of that question is, are there accountability measures in place to ensure governments and others implement the recommendations? So you might not know, and that's okay. But if you do know, like what is in place to ensure that something is going to be done by all of this amazing work?
I know we only have 11 minutes, and I could go on for a long time. The federal government is working on a national action plan. It's taking longer than we all thought. I have a lot of negative comments about that, but I won't go there in the interest of time. So there is a national action plan coming. Each province, each territory is working to move forward on the calls for justice in their own ways. Now, the difficulty is there's really no one place to go on the internet to find out what organizations, what governments are doing, other than in the Yukon. And they're generations ahead of the rest of Canada in terms of moving forward with our calls for justice. And I recommend their work in Yukon if you want a model. So at the government level, there's work done, but it's hard to know what's going on. At more the grassroots level, that's where the action really is, wonderfully so, in terms of working groups of frontline people, municipal people, police forces, healthcare providers. And they're getting together, sort of cross jurisdictions and saying, okay, let's pick one call for justice and start the most important one and start working on it. I realize it's very difficult with the number of calls for justice. It can be a little overwhelming, but what people are doing is saying, let's just pick one and work on that and make that our priority and develop strategies over the next year. Again, it's difficult because there's no one place on the internet to go to find out what people are doing, but it's the grassroots people. It's you who are making the changes and saying, okay, we're moving forward and this is what we're going to do.
Thank you. And it's interesting that you should mention the cross-sectoral, cross-departmental conversations that need to happen, that are happening. The next question that the group has asked is, considering your experience as a circuit judge and your work in communities, a lot of the work that's happening in British Columbia at the local level is people trying to do their work cross-sectorally, to not work in silos. So anti-violence workers working with, housing, BC Housing, and prosecutors and police and MCFD. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, how do we marry the calls to justice and that cross-sectoral work at the local level?
That's a really good question. I'll just give you some examples of what's happening elsewhere. Some people, we know people like their territory. We know people like their turf, right? And working in silos does not work to anybody's benefit, except to those who are empire builders, to be blunt. So what we need to do is put our egos aside for the larger picture. So what's been happening elsewhere is, for example, in Saskatoon, the mayor there said to his council, we're going to take this summer, this is going back some time, we're going to take this summer, everybody read the final report. We're going to come back in September and we're going to develop a strategy. Well, as he was reading the report, he started phoning the local health hospital administrators, I don't know what the proper term is, I'm sorry, and saying, join us. He called local police and said, send a rep, join us in our talks. And it just took that one person to reach out cross-sectorally and say, we need to talk and stop working in silos. So all it takes is one person to pick up the phone or send an email and say, we need to talk. In Saskatchewan, a group of women said, we're not waiting, we've waited long enough. And so they informally, by way of Zoom, invited police, healthcare, educators, I believe, I may be missing, to join them on a Zoom call to say, okay, what are the priorities? Let's talk in a very non-confrontational way. So it's extending the olive branch,
Brilliant. I love that. I love the idea of a group of Indigenous women contacting, the powers that be to say, okay, what are we going to do together going forward? That's amazing. Yeah. This is a request and not so much of a question. People are saying how deeply appreciative they are at your ethical dilemma questions that you've shared with us. And people are wondering is it possible for you to share those questions with us, and so that we can send them out and share them with the people that are online today? Is that possible?
Absolutely. I will email them to you later today. I might tidy up the grammar a little bit, but you'll get the point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Another question relates to I'll just read it here, that the person that's asking the question say that they've heard rising concerns about the impacts of anti-trafficking legislation and initiatives on sex workers. And so they're wondering, like, so the issue of anti-trafficking and sex work, did this come up in the commission? And yes, you've said that it has. And so the question is about how do we make sure that we decrease sex trafficking, but we don't judge sex workers for their autonomy, and the fact that so many sex workers are saying sex work is work.
Yeah, great question. I'm going to start off by saying human trafficking was one area that we just covered very superficially in our report, and one that has troubled me as a result ever since. And, you know, I think EVA would probably be a good organization, there may be others as well, I don't want to leave anybody out, to start a public education program about human trafficking. You know, I had no idea about the extensive nature, the big business nature, the organized crime-based nature of human trafficking. And when I look back on some cases that I had in court as a judge, I was like, oh my God, that was probably a human trafficking case. And I didn't recognize the symptoms of human trafficking. So I think there has to be a massive public education program based at kids in schools at all ages, people in the criminal justice system, healthcare, police especially. What are the symptoms of human trafficking? And we covered that in one of our calls for justice, by the way.
Yes, and you know, education being everything. I mean, I think our whole country lacks a sophistication of understanding what you know, the sort of social and economic issues and human rights issues faced by Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people. And as well, I think our society doesn't really understand gender-based violence in general, and public education, including education for the bench and the courts, because as you say, and we've heard this many times, is that you know, you as a judge are part of society, and that there's no doubt when cases come before people in decision-making positions, we need to make sure that you and your colleagues have the information to know the dynamics, or to know what's in front of you. Exactly.
And you know, we heard from police officers who said we have to do a massive education program for police all across Canada about the symptoms of human trafficking. And the same thing applied to people in the medical profession, health service providers, again, who have to see the symptoms, have to know what they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And I see we have 2 more minutes. If your clock is the same as mine, and I know that you have another engagement and you have to go, so we will respect your time. I don't know if there's a brief answer to this question, which is how can we best respond to the calls of justice from a cross-sectoral approach? I think we already answered that question, so pardon me. I think that we've covered that. And so we will allow you to get to your next engagement.
Thank you.
We will again offer our great respect to you, Judge Buller, for the work that you've done, and the work that I'm sure is still ahead, although I do hope there's some more rest in your future.
Well, thank you so much, Tracy. And thank you everyone for the important and very hard work you're doing every day. You're really making a difference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
You too.
Take care, everyone.